So sometimes we had to do things that were kind of tough. And then I went on to guides. And I loved guides. But then also there were times that the duty that I had to do, whether it was picking up really gross garbage from the side of the road, or whether it was having to sleep on a really hard mattress at camp, tested me. But then, when I was a teenager, I decided to try Pathfinders. Now sometimes I didn't want to go. And my mother said, remember you promised when you decided you would join that you would be a part of this group? And we had some fights, actually, about whether or not I would continue on in guides. Sometimes she let me stay home, but other times I heard her and continued on. And I made some really close friends in Pathfinders. And then I was in high school, and it really wasn't always so cool to be a guide, or it was, you had boyfriends and you were really busy with other things. But I don't know what it was. Maybe it was that promise. But I decided to sign up and wear that red scarf. When I did that, a whole bunch of things opened up to me. I went on a bunch of really neat trips. And so I learned a little bit more about the world. And our conversations broadened to discussions about what we would want to be as girls in the world. And we learned about different people in guiding who were amazing role models. Through all that time, I had really good leaders. Some of them maybe were not so great, but their hearts were in the right place. They really believed in what we promised. My brothers went through the same thing with the scouting movement. And I think they probably tell similar stories. One story I'd like to teach you, or to tell you about, is when I was a Brownie. We were learning our hostess badge. I don't know if anybody ever did the hostess badge in Brownies, but it's a really tough one. You have to cook squares like I cooked out there today. Last night at 11 o'clock, I'm making these squares, wondering whether or not they'll actually turn out, hoping that they'll be good enough to serve you, and I'm praying they will be. We had to learn how to make tea and coffee. We had to learn how to set a table and remember whether the fork and the knife and which spot it went on, and then you had to put the dinner plate, and then oh no, the dessert plate. Where did that go? And so we had to learn about that. And we had to learn how to talk to people. How to talk to people so that they felt welcome. So we went to one of the leaders' houses, and they invited a bunch of the old, in the end, we were there, we were all nervous, and we were all in our uniforms, and all of these elderly ladies arrived, and we took their coats, and we hung them up, and we took them to their seats, and we served them tea, and we learned whether to serve from the right side or the left side, and we had the leaders were all around us, turning us, and putting things on trays, and giving us little tips, and Mrs. Jones, she has horses, why don't you ask her about her horses? Oh, Mrs. Smith, she just lost her husband, so, be extra kind to her. And so we had a whole whack of this happening, and it was really nerve-wracking. And when all the guests left, we all went, wow, that was a lot of work. I can tell you that what I learned with that badge in that program has worked for me ever since. Sometimes I still don't set the table right. Sometimes I serve from the wrong side. Sometimes I don't feel like chatting to people and having conversations. But then I think, share and be a friend. By showing we care, it's love we send. Though the world is so wide, with love deep inside, I promise to share and be a friend. That comes from one of their songs that they sing. So then I have to think, okay, deep down inside, there's love that you share that I can share on to other people. The Scouting and the Guiding movement encourages its members to practice their religious beliefs. They encourage boys and girls to love God. Through their promise and their oaths, their codes, they pledge themselves. And part of that is to be a duty to God, a duty to your spirit. The ideals that religious movements claim, whether they be Hinduism, Buddhism, whether they be Islam or Judaism or Christianity, all have virtues. All are connected. And guiding and scouting movements help connect how religious flags can connect to their programming, to connect to the children and growing them as good and healthy people of our community. Most of guiding and scouting movements happen in churches. And that's because churches open their doors to service organizations. And we are so grateful that you've decided to make Grace your home. I know we have a committee called the Outreach Committee, and they decide how we're going to support organizations in our community. And every year, we're always happy to know that one of our nights, or two of our nights, or three of our nights are going to be filled with children and youth here in our church. One thing I realized, though, when I went to visit with them this past week, I asked many of you if you've ever been up in the church before. And they said, no, that's not where we're actually allowed. We have our meeting space. And so we had some fun, didn't we? Did you have who went up here? Yeah, some of you. Who went up there? Yeah. And we had a long conversation about who comes to this church and what we're going to be doing today. And I was really glad to do that. And I commend you to try to remember to do that, and as leaders to feel welcome. To book time to come up to explore the nooks and crannies of this church. Because we have a lot of people who do not come to church. And so in order for people to feel comfortable, they need to know that somebody said, your church looks like a castle this morning to me. It looks really imposing, like we're going to come in and there's going to be some knights and things in there. And I said, yeah, it does. But it's really kind of scary to open a castle door, isn't it, at times? Unless you know the nooks and crannies and know that it's a safe and healthy place to be. Scouting and guiding help put into practice some of the basic truths that they are taught by their religions and their parents. It's a place where you can delve into talents. It's different from school, even though sometimes some of the programming seems a bit schoolish. There are things you can discover that maybe you could never discover in school. I went horseback riding. Never done that, except in riding. My daughter Thursday night, went snowshoeing for the first time. I was hearing on the news coming in from CBC on my very long drive in from Henfield this morning that teachers are worried about the amount of time that youth are spending on their iPhones or their devices, on their computers. And on the story they said they're worried that people aren't learning to come together, to look people in the eye, and to learn how to have conversations. Similar to what I learned in the hostess badge, similar to what you guys learned by greeting people today. Did you have some nice conversations with people today? That's important. And the teacher said we need to have different classes to teach people how to do this now. I think that's kind of a silly state of affairs. So I'm glad to know that our church sponsors organizations like this, and that we open up our welcome. Welcome, I learned this past week when I was putting together a presentation for our board about affirming congregations, is interesting. Words like welcome and inclusion suggest that those on the inside have power. Power to choose to accept those on the outside, like an act of charity. And that's not what we'd like to see happen here. We'd like to know you to know that you are welcome, and that even just by being here today and being here in the weekly evening meetings, that you are now part of our congregation. And just being here, it changes us. This church, we're not a private club. And we're not gatekeepers that say who can come and who can go. As soon as you come through the door, all of you today, this community has become a new community. God's love is wider than we could ever know and imagine, let alone live out, even though we do try in the guiding and studying